So Markus, you're a professor of international relations at the Vienna School of International Studies. You've done a lot of work on globalization, which we're going to talk about. Before we go into that discussion, I thought I would just ask you to describe how your career has led you to this point. What causes you to have this high degree of interest in globalization?
Yeah, that's a great question, because that story starts in Canada. So it's during my doctoral studies, and we were a very tightly knit group of doctoral students, and then we came up with this idea to write on metaphors of globalization, and then we did a workshop, and the subtitle of it was Mirrors, Magicians, and Mutiny. So what kind of conceptual language is there for metaphors to describe what globalization is? To what extent does that actually have political consequences, the magicians? And the mutinies, what kind of normative research could be done on metaphors of globalization? So that was my entry point. And then I hadn't done anything on globalization for a long time. And then TV Paul and I, so that's the next Canadian link there, we stumbled over this term deglobalization and other disciplines, so in economics and sociology. And then we wanted to inquire, does it actually, is it applicable to the world in which we live now, or to what extent? And this is basically how I got interested in it. Yeah.
Well, it's an area that there is a lot of interest in at the moment. There's a lot of uncertainty, I think, amongst many people that are active on an international level as to what the future of globalization might hold. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. But what you've been discussing there really raises the question of what globalization is and how we might define it. And I read a discussion that you had written that really questioned this, that really described that there were a number of different definitions, and that perhaps the term itself was a bit unclear. So I'm not sure my question is fair in asking, what do you think globalization is? No,
that's a very fair question. Yeah. Let me answer that in two steps. So one of them, basically the scope of globalization, dimensions of globalization, and the other one juxtaposing globalization, deglobalization. So the dimensions, and I think that's an important point. So there are lots of dimensions of globalization, and one of them is to think of it in terms of, say, economics. There we are with global trade, global finance, and so on. And so it's basically say the material side of globalization. That is obviously very important in many ways. But then there is also there's also a less tangible side in which we understand the world as one place. So where we think of community transcending nation-state boundaries and all of that. Yeah. And now one could add lots of other dimensions to that. So let's say the COVID crisis taught us that biologically speaking, there is actually a lot of globalization of the world in terms of viruses. Yeah. And we know, of course, climate change is very much a global phenomenon. So that too is a dimension of globalization. So there are lots and lots of those dimensions. And now what the literature usually does is it says, yeah, so there is globalization, and there are some authors that say, okay, so this goes in waves. So at times there's globalization, and there's again deglobalization, and up and down again. others who have more of a binary view, so, and perhaps a less historical one, so it's always one or the other. And I think that that's not very helpful. I think if there are lots of different dimensions of globalization, then we also have to look at how these different dimensions of globalization develop. And if I go with my example, say the global health field, the viruses, then yes, so there has been a globalization going on that is especially then sparked with colonialism and everything. So that infectious diseases, or more technical term for that, communicable diseases, they spread globally, and they still very much do, and yes, and they will in future. And I don't see any kind of deglobalization there at all. Yeah. And then there are these other dimensions. So if we think about this intersubjective dimension in terms of imagining the world as being connected, yeah, then there, I think there are tendencies of deglobalization. Yeah, so say populist governments, usually doesn't matter whether left wing or right wing. They basically pretend the nation state can do everything, right? So basically, like in the Middle Ages, the imaginary is that you build your big walls, and then you're impenetrable, so nothing can happen to you anymore. And that I think is highly problematic. But the important thing then is always that these globalization, deglobalization tendencies, they can be very, very much in tension with one another. I think that's important.
I mean, it's a fascinating area now because of the range of aspects of it which are in debate or in discussion, and which there is a wide range of opinion on what the future should be like, and what the future perhaps will be like, and whether or not that is the way people think it should be. But such a wide range. I mean, simply on an economic level, there is the range from protectionism to not, with health, with social questions, with immigration, and many areas. So in understanding the nature of globalization today and the changes that may be happening, it may be useful to start with, how did we get to where we are today? There's been substantial change in all of these areas that have now led to a position that we're in at the moment. And that, I don't know if you can help the audience understand how we got to where we are today.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question. The issue perhaps is there where to start. Yeah. So my example from before, and colonialization. That is often where some sociologists then start also with the globalization. Yeah. But if we look perhaps at the more recent past, maybe that is more useful. Yeah. So then at the end of the Second World War, there was, of course, the building of a particular order, probably a liberal order. That's probably correct if one describes it that way. And underlying that is this idea that if you cooperate, then relations between states are going to be more peaceful. So and of course also Ricardo, law of comparative advantage, underpinning all of that. So if we cooperate with one another, then not only will security be more plentiful, but wealth as well. Yeah? And so this kind of reasoning probably culminates in the 1990s. Globally, but also regionally in many parts of the world, so most definitely in Europe. Europe, then so the European Union tries at the same time enlargement and deepening integration, both at the same time. Yeah? And we have also there then this more and more global governance. So the term global governance makes it in 1995 at the United Nations, and scholars, especially in political science, but also here too, they use the term then quite extensively, taking it actually for granted that something like global governance would be there. So this idea, okay, so there are more and more of these global transactions, and somehow all of this has to be regulated. And in my view, the point where we are now is this so there has been in many ways more and more globalization sparked even more so in the 1990s than before. And we have now a situation where, in terms of international politics, there's the attempt at least to regulate, to have legally binding instruments in lots of different issue areas, many of which previously were in the realm of nation states, prerogative of nation states, and that was it. And what we've witnessed now in the last 20 years or so is the scaling down of global governance, the crisis of multilateralism. So that many of these material objective things that I talked about with these dimensions beforehand, they continue in terms of globalization. We could also talk about security and everything in that way. But at the same time, the willingness to govern all of this, to have rules and regulations, stick to that willingness is declining. So one could also say, so still a lot of globalization, but less and less governance of that. And of course, there are attempts to correct that. Yeah? And then in the 2024, then the UN Summit of the Future really tries to do lots and lots of different things. And we'll see to what extent that's going to be successful or not. Yeah, but if you, I mean, I really hope it will be successful. But that would mean that it breaks away from a certain trend that we've had for quite a while now, and the trend, I think, that is quite
so what you're saying is that we saw a steady growth over the past several decades of globalization, that there was broad acceptance, I guess, the majority opinion in many parts of the world was that this was a good thing and it was delivering benefits. But we've now come to a point where opinion around that has become more negative in many areas. But what you're also saying, which I think is very interesting, and you, I think, used the term in something you wrote where you said simultaneous growth and decline of interconnectedness. You seem to have defined that further or described that further in your response by saying that globalization is continuing to increase, but regulation of it is declining. And that seems not necessarily to correspond to what the stated intentions of governments would be. The intention of the governments, some of them, would be that globalization itself decline along with the decline in regulation. You're saying that's not happening, that globalization is continuing to increase. And my sense would be that you are suggesting that the decline in regulation is a bad thing.
The decline in regulation, I think, is a really bad thing, yeah, because I need so let's talk about science and technology. We haven't talked about that yet, yeah. So that is probably a major driver of globalization in many different ways. Yeah. So if I want to have a big scientific breakthrough about something, then usually it's a cooperation across state boundaries. Yeah. That's one thing. Then the other one is digital technology means leaps and leaps and leaps in political communication and in interconnecting people. But that can obviously, we all know that can go into different directions. Yeah, so that can be a force towards more democracy. It can be a force towards meaningful exchanges transnationally, so across the borders of nation states. And there is quite a bit of that happening, but it can also be, of course, the opposite, right? So it can be the echo chambers of this world. It can be the growth of transnational. I mean, ironically enough, transnational movements that suddenly pretend, okay, so the nation state can do it all, harking back to some old kind of ethno-nationalism. So we see that in many parts of the world. If we look at the rise of populist parties across the world, actually, and if one looks at statistics in the last 20 years, I mean, it's just a very, very significant increase. And it's probably difficult to make sense of that without the rise of social media and without all kind of different informations, echo chambers, the flows of information that come with the internet. And that would probably mean that one has to somehow find ways to regulate it. But then it's interesting, right? So again, I mean, so that the states alone can't regulate all that much. So I'm talking to you now from Austria, right? So there is no Austrian owner, at least to my knowledge, of a major social media platform. Yeah, those people are elsewhere. They are in the United States, but they're also in other places. And so what is the Austrian state then supposed to do if it thinks, okay, there's certain things that are not covered by freedom of expression also, yeah? So I think it's yet another one of those examples where states, if they want to regulate something, would have to come together and find ways of doing that. Otherwise, they won't do it at all. Otherwise, it's going to be the Elon Musks of this world or others, yeah. And the more technology, I mean, science and technology, I find is always such a good example for that, because the growth in terms of how technology advances is exponential, yeah. And so with artificial intelligence, people like us have to watch out now for student papers to be actually written by students and everything. And we all know that this technology is going to improve a lot in the future. We could already have this conversation in a way that I don't know, I could be a deep fake and you probably wouldn't realize it. But then my technological setup, I mean, probably would look better, yeah. and so there's probably a lot of need for these rules and regulations internationally, but states find it very difficult to do so, and oftentimes they don't even try all that much anymore. But they just go to the electorate and say, "Hey, we can do that. We can fortify ourselves, and then everything's going to be fine. And any kind of influence from the outside is bad. So we have to take care of it."
So what you seem to be suggesting is that the developments in technology highlight very much the need for regulation in globalization. And you are also, I think, arguing that that need for regulation also spreads into other areas, but that the desire that governments have to in some way isolate themselves, perhaps technology prevents that happening, even if it was at something which was desirable and likely to have positive consequences. It's very unlikely to happen. This really, your response seems to call into question whether this isolationism is really realistically achievable for most countries, given the technology in the world today.
Right. No, I think it's completely unachievable. I think it's completely unachievable. It's a myth. But I think that the myth, unfortunately, is doing pretty well at the moment in considerable segments of society across the globe. Yeah, and when we look at say at the United Nations and where multilateralism leads us at the moment, then it looks actually fairly dire. Yeah? So with my students, once a year we do a simulation about a legally binding instrument being negotiated right now. And over the years, we find it more and more difficult actually to find something that is being negotiated, and I think that's quite telling. Yeah? And so there's a movement into directions, I think, that are really not necessarily warranted. Yeah. And then, of course, there are all kinds of other crisis moments that make this kind of building order even more difficult. Yeah. So a lot of these attempts at the moment, they are disrupted by Russia's war in the Ukraine, and then there can be negotiations about a plastic convention or something like that, so that really shouldn't have much to do with it. But there's always the risk that that this kind of military crisis is going to interfere suddenly in fairly technical negotiations on the environment. Yeah. And another example that I find actually quite, almost bewildering. One thinks that so the COVID crisis, I mean, some estimates to say about 20 million people dead worldwide. I mean, really drove it home to us. I think that global health really matters. Yeah, so that these and global health statistics, of course, were always quite scary to look at. Yeah, oftentimes more scary actually than statistics on armed conflict. Yeah? But it probably has COVID, I think, should have driven it home to us that that one has to do something about global health. But there's not much happening. Yeah? So there were debates about a pandemic treaty, about upgrading the international health regulations and all of that. So actually honoring the promise of the WHO Constitution, health for everyone, a state of complete absence of physical or mental illness. Yeah, so the very demanding definition, but we are very far away from that. Yeah? And it's not only the infectious diseases that I've talked now quite a little bit about. It's actually, for the most part, it's the modern lifestyle diseases. Yeah, it's the non-communicable diseases, the chronic diseases that cause death. And so that there's very little movement there. Yeah? So it's almost, to me, it's often almost as if states wanted to deny, or many states wanted to deny a reality that there is all of this interconnectedness, for better or for worse, whether you like it or not, and you cannot just cut it off. Yeah? So you cannot introduce an obligation for a virus to apply for a visa. it just won't work. Yeah? So for better or for worse, you have to find global solutions, and it doesn't look very promising at the moment.
Very sad, because very clearly what you're saying is that unfettered globalization or unregulated globalization will lead to people being less healthy, the world being more dangerous, the environment being very negatively impacted with climate change, and many, many other things. But that the idea that in some way things are going to get better because of this is, completely unrealistic. You describe the international political order as it existed up until recently, I suppose, as the liberal order. And I wanted to ask you about how the changes that we're seeing are influencing that order, how that order is changing. To some degree, you've described that by saying, it's declining, and we're seeing less regulation. But I wonder whether you could talk a little bit more there about how the political forces on that international level are now changing, perhaps. Are you you're not optimistic about the liberal order, is my sense, or how do you feel about that?
For me, the issue really is to sum up what we had beforehand, so that we really have a problem with rules and regulations, yeah. And some of those rules and regulations are really very, very fundamental, yeah. And one of them is definitely territorial integrity. And so what Russia is doing to the Ukraine there at the moment, it's just a flagrant violation of territorial integrity. And so on top of it, there's an annexation of parts of the territory of the Ukraine. So these are the kinds of things that, those kind of very foundational rules and norms, if they fall, if they get seriously weakened, then we really find ourselves in a kind of world order that I think really, really don't want to live in. Yeah. Yeah.
So what you're saying is that really the period we're going through at the moment is one where there's a high degree of uncertainty, and the possibilities within that uncertainty are maybe fairly extreme. If we're seeing a decline in respect for, well, we clearly are in Ukraine, with respect for international borders, and we're seeing the decline of institutions that are intended to help us to deal with these types of situations. That is a world that potentially is quite, as you said, one that we would not wish to live in. Have you got any sense of what you think is likely to happen? As someone who looks at this, do you have a path that you think is more likely for the world to follow? Or as a specialist in this area, are you looking at it and saying, I really am not sure about what's going to happen now?
No, I'm really not sure what's going to happen now. But one can think of different scenarios. So one of those scenarios is a competitive world order that where there are all kinds of geopolitical tensions, clashes, so a high instability fought out by great powers ultimately. So that's probably one of the scenarios. Yeah. A super worst case scenario would be that things really spiral out of control. Yeah. So let's say we in Vienna yesterday we had a discussion about the nuclear order nuclear taboo, a weakening of the nuclear taboo. Yeah. That ties in a little bit with the Ukraine, because obviously Russia does make explicit and implicit threats to use nuclear weapons, also targets civilian nuclear infrastructure. But it also ties in with our discussion previously about technology. Yeah. So the nuclear arsenals around the world, they're being modernized as we speak. Amongst other things, this means to make some weapon categories leaner but meaner. So the line between conventional weapons and nuclear weapons will be increasingly blurred. What does that mean then for upholding a nuclear taboo? So what does that mean actually not to use nuclear weapons as first use? And so this is definitely one of the problems for the future. And it's yet another one of those examples where obviously that has very much global repercussions. Even a limited nuclear exchange has global repercussions, and up to the point if it's even a limited one between India and Pakistan, for instance, can lead to something like a nuclear winter and so on, yeah, with massive environmental consequences. And we're again at the technology, and we're again at the need to regulate technology, yeah. And so we're now in terms of arms control agreements that looks as dire as the time when I was born, yeah. And after that, there were lots and lots of, not lots of them, but quite a few important nuclear arms control agreements. Yeah, and over the last decade, we have just witnessed one of them collapsing after the other. That is something that great powers do, but it's not necessarily something that is only felt by great powers. It's very much felt by the great majority of states, and they obviously don't have a say in that. Yeah. So I think that we have a big problem at our hands.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to look at the period that we're going through now as has been described elsewhere as a fourth industrial revolution. And I think it's useful to reflect on the first industrial revolution and the alignments that changed and the things that happened in international relations at that time. And some of the other things that flowed from that, the growth of democracy perhaps being one of those. And I think in some ways it's useful to look at the world now and say, you know, are we going through something similar where the changes that are happening in technology are having influences in many areas in the way that technology is being applied? And therefore, are we seeing a redefinition of international relationships because of that?
Yes, yeah. No, definitely. I mean, so fourth industrial revolution basically being a digital revolution, yeah. And yes, I mean, so one can explain a lot of things with technological advancements, but they can really go into very different directions, yeah. So one thought experiment I always find interesting there is so big technological invention very back in the day was the printing press. Yeah, it's actually quite well established now that without the printing press we probably wouldn't have had nations. Yeah, so printing press meant that there was a vernacular language that was needed. So language not just spoken, whatever, in a tiny little valley somewhere behind the next mountain, but much broader than that. Yeah, and that made it then possible, in Benedict Anderson's words, to imagine the nation, and that's quite interesting, right? Because with digital technology, you know, suddenly communication can actually go global, and it does go global. So there seem to be possibilities a little bit to understand a little more that the world is in many ways one, and is very much interconnected. It's just that at the moment it doesn't really happen that way. Yeah? I mean, what happens at the moment is, yes, a lot of transnational communication, a lot of transnational social movements, but they don't necessarily embrace a global outlook, but they oftentimes seek very, very strong demarcation from others. And that obviously oftentimes has a lot of local repercussions. Yeah, so I'm doing a book project now on the Horn of Africa, and if one looks there, it's sort of the kind of digital technology, social media, and everything. They oftentimes had a detrimental effect in conflicts. Yeah. So where diaspora groups used particularly strong language against other ethnic groups, and even dehumanizing language, and so where the fire was fueled even more. So yes, a lot of transnationalism, but not necessarily the kind that's that is not sectarian, not necessarily the kind that looks at the grand order of things.
So you're touching on the last point, really, that I had on my list of items for us to discuss, which was the consequences for poorer countries of the changes that we're seeing in globalization now. So you've described one area of that, the impact of technology on polarization, sectarianism, negative consequences inside poorer countries. Some of those, of course, also in non-poor countries. But could you talk about how the trends that we're seeing now in globalization are impacting poorer countries?
Yeah, probably. So economically speaking, if one, so that's not a big generalization that I make. Yeah? But in terms of economically speaking, there seems to be even more inequality within those states, and there seems to be even more inequality between those states and the global south and the global north. That seems to be one trend that can be observed. Yeah. And then for me, there's this big thing about political communication. Yeah, so that on the one hand it can be very liberating. Yeah, and some opposition politicians in African states, they actually were quite successful in launching a campaign and making a strong campaign thanks to social media. So that there's definitely also that side. But then, of course, there is always a counter move that and governments at some stage, they understand that the internet at times can be useful, at times it can't be. It's not, and if it's not, then it's simply shut down, or all kinds of fake news and everything are diffused. So it's very much a two-edged sword. There's of course also the problem that technological inventions and novelty and everything that doesn't necessarily get distributed then easily to some states in the global south. Although of course there are also the opposite examples. Yeah, so India seems to be very, very, very dynamic now for lots of reasons. But also lots of technological expertise, yeah. And if one thinks that further, I mean, so in terms of artificial intelligence, then obviously China is doing very, very well there, and Yeah, one reason being because they have they have a lot of scientists. They have a lot of data to play around with, and this massive volume of data challenges them actually to find ways of machine learning and everything that can cope with these enormous amounts of data. Yeah. And what remains to be seen. I mean, so there is oppressive potential, and there is also more liberating one. Yeah? The oppressive one was quite clearly shown also with the outbreak of COVID. Yeah, so there was way before China informed the World Health Organization. There were obviously a few doctors, one in particular, that went on social media platforms and asked his colleagues, "What is happening here? Reminds me of looks like a coronavirus to me, highly infectious." For him, it was SARS-CoV-1. Yeah, so the previous corona one, but he was not far off the mark. Yeah. But these people were then targeted straight away, and he eventually died of SARS-CoV-2. Yeah. So yeah, and so yes, that's also really quite a drastic example I find of this globalization, deglobalization. Yes, so on the one hand, that is a state regulation to do away with the truth, and that obviously has then a lot of repercussion in terms of the global spread of the virus, in terms of it becoming a pandemic. Yeah.
Our discussion, I think, raises, I think, probably some degree of uncertainty, perhaps a degree of fear amongst people who would be watching it, in terms of, at least based on the uncertainty of what the future might hold as far as international relations are concerned, and the range of possibilities which there are there. It may cause some people who are watching this to think, well, should I be doing something to try and influence things in a more positive direction? It suggests that those of us who I would hope are a global majority who desire a peaceful world should perhaps try and contribute to that in some way. So my closing question really is, have you advice for people who are watching for how they might individually contribute to ensuring the world remains or becomes a better place to live?
No, you asked me a lot of very good questions. That one was the best one. No, because basically we've always talked now about structures, about big structures. Yeah. But these big structures, of course, they are actually put into place by human beings. So, there is a lot of agency, and that is a very important thing to bear in mind. Yeah. And it is there. I'm just going to mention a few examples. Yeah. So one of the things that I talked about was nuclear weapons. Yeah. So it is very important that these kind of weapons remain stigmatized. Civil society will play a very important role in that. Yeah. So one can't reiterate often enough how dangerous these kinds of weapons are, and that they can put an end to humanity. Yeah. That's a very important point. Perhaps more practical. So I talked briefly about the UN Summit of the Future, yeah, 2024. There are all kinds of ways to have one's ideas being channeled in the United Nations system. Yeah. So just one example, the Digital Global Compact. You can check that out online. And there are ways for civil society to get their proposals seen and heard and everything. So I would definitely recommend to do as much of that as possible. And also to be realistic. And realistic, I think, in that sense, really means to say, okay, there are lots and lots of challenges, and many of the challenges that we face, they are global in nature, and that has to be recognized, because then that means they have to be regulated globally as well. And yes, that means to make compromises. So we can't do without concessions. Sometimes these compromises hurt. But things have to move in terms of meaningful rules and regulations, and that can safeguard a democratic system, that can make for, I think, more equality in the world. We talked about that too. And that can actually basically really do these things, follow up on a lot of things that have been agreed upon, widely agreed upon, unanimously agreed upon by states in the past. Yeah, if you think about something like Universal Declaration of Human Rights, universally agreed quite some time ago, yeah, 75 years ago. Then that is actually remains an important document, but in the light of today's challenges, I think, okay, what does it actually mean? What does it mean to have a human rights perspective on, say, digital international affairs? What does it mean to have a human rights perspective on economics, on the environment, on health, and many things that we've talked about. Yeah. And some governments, of course, they're much more forthcoming to do that than others. I mean, the Canadian one actually is in many ways. Yeah. May not always be enough, but I think it in many ways it goes into the right direction. Yeah, I would say about the Austrian government something quite similar. And yes, it will be difficult sometimes to sway the very powerful, but at least I think one has to try. And if things go really wrong, and if rules are violated in internal conflicts, in interstate conflicts, and they're violated flagrantly, then I think it's important for civil society, global civil society, and academics like the two of us are part of that, to stand up and voice that, and I think that everyone can do that, and part of the Summit of the Future of the UN is also sort of this language in terms of multi-stakeholders, and to understand that United Nations has to be more than just basically the privileged position of 5 major powers. Yeah? And I think there is a lot of room at the moment to have an input there. And there's always, when things are in flux, and things really are in flux in the world order at the moment, then one can also change things towards the better. So that I'm convinced of.
Yes, and I am too, and I'm hopeful that that the majority of us who want these things can make them happen.
Let's hope, Peter. Let's hope.
Yes, absolutely. It's been a great pleasure talking to you, Markus, today. I really appreciate you doing this for the students at the University of Waterloo. So really thank you. And if ever there's anything similar that I can do for you, I'd be very happy.
I know, I think of something. I'd be happy too. And yeah, and hello to Canada, as I lived there for 5.5 years of my life, and I greatly enjoyed it. So all the best.
I'm glad.
Okay. Peter, bye-bye.